The envelope was still in my hand when I walked through the front door. I hadn't opened it yet. I'd stood in the driveway for a full minute, staring at the return address from the bank, feeling that particular kind of stillness that settles into your chest when your body knows something your mind hasn't caught up to. The oak trees along the fence were perfectly motionless. No wind, no birds, just that waiting kind of quiet that comes before something breaks. Inside, my wife was on the phone. She didn't hear me come in. She was standing at the kitchen counter with her back to me, speaking low and fast, her free hand pressed flat against the granite like she needed to steady herself. Her daughter sat at the table across from her, a mug between both palms, eyes cast down. The baby monitor on the counter hummed softly. My granddaughter, not mine by blood, but mine by the 2 years I'd watched her take her first steps across these floors, was asleep upstairs. Neither of them looked up when I set my keys down. I opened the envelope. The number at the top of the second page hit me like stepping off a curb I didn't see coming. $43,218. Drawn against the home equity line of credit I had refinanced 18 months ago to fund the kitchen renovation. A kitchen renovation that had cost $11,000 and been finished the previous spring. I set the paper on the counter between them. My wife turned around. Her eyes went to the statement before they went to me. Her daughter's head lifted slowly. Neither of them spoke. I asked one question. Where did the rest go? I need to go back 3 years for any of this to make sense. I was 61 when I married my wife. Widowed at 58, 3 years of silence and Saturday mornings that stretched into the afternoon with no particular shape. My son had moved to Portland. My daughter was in Charlotte with her own family. The house in Crestwood, Tennessee, the one I'd bought in my 30s and paid off before my 50s, had started to feel less like a home and more like a monument to something that had ended. My wife came into my life through a mutual friend at a church fundraiser. She laughed at things that were actually funny. She asked questions and listened to the answers. She told me about her daughter without apology, just the plain facts. 26 years old, a toddler from a relationship that hadn't worked out, living in an apartment that cost too much on a salary that wasn't enough. I respected the honesty of it. I thought I understood what I was agreeing to. 3 months after we married, her daughter moved into the guest room. Just temporarily, my wife had said. Just until she gets the deposit together for a better place. She has the baby to think about. You understand. I did understand. I was a father. I knew what it meant to want to protect your child from difficulty. What I didn't understand yet was the difference between protecting someone and removing every consequence from their path. My wife's daughter was not a bad person. I want to be clear about that. She was young and overwhelmed and had made choices that compounded on each other the way poor choices tend to do. What she lacked was not character. What she lacked was any experience of being responsible for her own situation. Her mother had ensured that. The first year, I paid for everything without complaint. Groceries, utilities, the streaming services, the occasional emergency that seemed to arrive with remarkable frequency. A car repair, a medical bill the insurance didn't cover, a lawyer's consultation about custody. I paid because I could, and because family helps family, and because I told myself it was temporary. In the second year, temporary became structural. My wife suggested we simplify things. One account, she said. It's easier. You work so much. I handle the house anyway. Let me manage it. I was 62 by then, running my own contracting business, still climbing roofs when the job required it. I came home tired in a way that settled into the bones differently than it had at 40. The idea of not having to track receipts and split bills appealed to me in a way I didn't examine closely enough. I added her to the primary account. The first year of that arrangement, I noticed the balance was lower than it should have been, but not dramatically so. When I asked, my wife had explanations. The baby needed a specialist, her daughter's car registration, dental work that couldn't wait. Each explanation was plausible. Each one arrived with a version of, you wouldn't want me to have said no to that, would you? I wouldn't. So I didn't push. The HELOC had been my wife's suggestion too. We'd talked about updating the kitchen for months. The counters were original to the house, the appliances aging. It's an investment, she said. It increases the property value. You've put everything into this house. You deserve to enjoy it. She wasn't wrong about the renovation. What she didn't mention was what she planned to do with the remaining credit. I sat down at the kitchen table with the bank statement and looked at my wife across the surface I had refinanced to afford. Her daughter stood up from her chair and started to move toward the hallway. I said her name. I called her by what she was to me, my stepdaughter, and asked her to sit down. She sat. My wife began carefully. She said there were things she'd been meaning to discuss. She said the timing wasn't ideal. She said she had intended to get ahead of it before the statement arrived. I let her talk. Then I asked again, where did $43,000 go? The silence that followed was a different kind than the one outside. This one had weight in it. My stepdaughter spoke first. She said she needed it for the apartment, the new one she'd moved into in February. The deposit was 3 months' rent, and there'd been fees and furniture, and the baby needed a proper room set up, and it happened faster than she expected, and she was going to pay it back. She really was. She just needed time. I looked at my wife. My wife looked at the table. How much of the $43,000? I asked slowly. Went to the apartment situation? About $9,000, my stepdaughter said. I did the arithmetic in my head. What about the other 34? My stepdaughter looked at her mother. My wife's hands were flat on the counter again. She said it had gone to various things, over time, that the line of credit had been useful for smoothing over gaps, that she'd kept track, that it wasn't as bad as it looked. I asked her to show me the tracking. She said she didn't have it in front of her. I said we'd wait. There's a particular quality to a confrontation when the other person realizes that what they're facing is not anger but arithmetic. Anger can be managed. It can be redirected, apologized into submission, dissolved with tears or tenderness. Numbers don't respond to any of that. Numbers sit on a page and continue to be exactly what they are, regardless of how anyone feels about them. My wife retrieved her phone. She opened a notes app she'd apparently used to track some of the expenses. Not all of them. Some. The entries were inconsistent, months missing, categories vague. Household, car, emergency, medical. I asked about a transaction from the previous October. An online payment to something I didn't recognize. My stepdaughter's face changed. My wife said it was for her daughter's expenses. I asked what kind of expenses came from that particular vendor. I'd looked it up on my phone while they weren't watching. It was a financing platform, the kind associated with personal loans brokered online. My stepdaughter said she'd had some debts. From before, from when the baby's father was still in the picture and things had been complicated, she'd needed to consolidate. I asked how much. $8,000. I set my phone face down on the table. I want to be precise about what I felt in that moment, because it wasn't rage. Rage is hot and immediate. What I felt was colder than that. It was the sensation of understanding something you'd been half aware of for a long time, finally stepping fully into the light. Every explanation that had seemed plausible, every bill that had arrived with a story attached, every time I'd felt the unease and chosen to trust the explanation over the feeling, it had all been pointing at this table, this statement, this number. My wife reached across and put her hand over mine. She said she was sorry. She said she had not intended for it to get this far. She said they had been trying to fix it on their own. I turned my hand over and picked up the bank statement. I told them I needed some air. I walked out to the garage and closed the door. I had built a workbench along the back wall of that garage 14 years earlier, before I was widowed, before any of this. The wood was scarred now from years of projects. I sat on the stool in front of it and looked at the grain of the pine for a long time. When I'd bought this house, I'd been 34 years old with a young family and a mortgage that required careful management of every dollar. I had learned early what money was, time converted into something tangible. Every hour on a job site, every estimate written, every invoice followed up on it translated into the stability that let my children grow up without worrying about the lights being on. I was 63 years old. I had earned the right to sit still in my own garage without the understanding that my earnings were being allocated somewhere I hadn't agreed to. I went back inside around 9 o'clock. My stepdaughter had gone upstairs. My wife was at the kitchen table with the lights low, hands wrapped around a mug, waiting. She started to speak and I held up one hand. I said I needed to hear the full number, not the pieces, not the rounded figures. Everything, she told me. Between the HELOC draws, the transfers from the joint account, and what I later discovered when I requested a full 18 months of statements, the total came to just over $61,000. Over 22 months. My wife cried when I said it back to her out loud. Real tears, I think. I had learned by then that real tears and strategic tears can look identical, but the difference matters in terms of what they're asking you to do with them. I told her I wasn't going to shout. I told her I wasn't going to say things I'd regret. I told her that what happened next was going to be calm and clear and that she should prepare herself for it. She asked me what that meant. I said, I'm going to figure out how to protect what I have left. I called my attorney the next morning before anyone came downstairs. He was a man I'd used for contract disputes in the business, direct and methodical. I told him the situation in plain terms. He asked several questions, made several notes, and then told me what my options were. We spoke for 40 minutes. When I hung up, I made coffee and sat on the back porch. The yard was coming into its spring color, the azaleas along the fence starting to open. I had planted those the first year after my wife and I married. An optimistic gesture I remembered clearly, standing in the afternoon light in the yard of a house I loved, believing I was beginning something good. I still believed the house was good. I had revised my opinion about some of its current occupants. My stepdaughter came downstairs at 8:30 carrying the baby on her hip. She stopped when she saw me through the sliding door. She came out anyway. She sat across from me and held her daughter in her lap, and for a moment, neither of us said anything. The baby grabbed at her grandmother's bracelet, the one that had been a gift from me on our first anniversary. I noticed my wife wasn't wearing it. My stepdaughter said she owed me an explanation. I said I was listening. She talked for a long time, about how she had gotten behind before she'd even arrived here, about debts the baby's father had left in her name, about how her mother had started covering things because she couldn't bear to watch her daughter struggle, about how it had scaled from there without either of them fully reckoning with where it was going. I asked her one question. At any point, did you think about what this was costing me? She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I told myself you could afford it. That was the most honest thing anyone in that house had said to me in months. I told her that what someone can afford and what they have consented to are different things. That the second one requires a conversation, that I had never been asked. She looked down at the baby. I know, she said. I know that now. My wife and I sat at the kitchen table that afternoon with the doors closed. I had printed several pages from the conversation with my attorney, not because I needed the notes, but because I wanted her to understand that I had already moved past the stage of deciding whether to act. I told her 3 things. First, I was removing her name from the HELOC and from the joint account effective at the end of the month. My attorney had explained the process. I had already scheduled the appointments. Second, the remaining credit available on the line of credit was frozen. No further draws. I would be working with the bank to restructure the repayment over the next several years. Third, if she and her daughter wished to remain in this house, they would pay a combined $800 per month in rent, cover their own food and incidentals, and have no access to any of my financial accounts in any form. My wife said I was treating her like a tenant. I said I was offering her terms I didn't have to offer. She said this was not what marriage was supposed to be. I said marriage was supposed to involve honesty about money. She said she had been trying to protect her daughter. I said she had done it with my retirement. That landed the way I intended it to. She looked at the table. I wasn't shouting. My voice hadn't risen above the register I use when I'm reading a bid proposal. That steadiness seemed to unsettle her more than any volume would have. She had expected something she could push against. I wasn't giving her anything to push against. She asked what happened if they couldn't afford the $800. I told her that would be information about their situation, not mine. She stood up. She said she needed time to think. I told her she had 30 days. The first week was tense in the particular way that comes from people living in close proximity while pretending to be elsewhere. My wife cooked dinner twice and left mine in the oven without telling me. I ate it. I said thank you. I went to bed without incident. My stepdaughter kept mostly to the upstairs. I would hear her moving around, hear the baby's sounds through the ceiling when I was working at my desk in the evenings. I did not go upstairs. I did not initiate conversation. I was not unkind when we crossed paths. I simply stopped being available in the way I had spent 2 years making myself available. The baby, of course, was the complicated part. She was 2 years old and had no understanding of any of what surrounded her. When she saw me at the bottom of the stairs, she raised her arms the way she always had. I held her when that happened. That was not a financial decision. By the second week, my wife shifted into what I recognized, with the clarity of hindsight, as her second strategy. She came to my office one evening while I was reviewing contracts and sat down across from me the way she used to in the early days when we talked about everything. She said she had been doing a lot of thinking. She said she could see how the situation had gotten out of hand. She said she took responsibility for her part in it. I waited. She said, but surely there's a middle path. Surely we don't have to be so formal about everything. There it was. Not accountability, a renegotiation. I told her that the formality was the point, that the informality of the previous 2 years was precisely what had cost me $61,000. Her expression shifted. She said I seemed determined to make this as difficult as possible. I said I seemed determined to not repeat the last 2 years. Those two things felt different to me. She left the office without slamming the door. I went back to my contracts. On the 21st day, my stepdaughter knocked on the door of the garage where I was working on a cabinet. She stood in the doorway for a moment, then asked if she could come in. I said yes. She sat on the old stool by the door, the baby not with her, which meant this was intentional. She said she had been applying for jobs, a real one, full-time, with benefits. She'd had an interview that week. She said she had also called the baby's father and had a conversation she had been avoiding for over a year about support payments and his responsibilities. I set down my chisel. She said she was not telling me this to earn points. She said she was telling me because she thought I deserved to know that she had heard what I'd said on the porch, about consent and about the difference between affordability and permission. She said it had stayed with her. I told her I was glad to hear it. She asked me if I had ever given up on someone. I thought about it. I told her I didn't think I'd given up on her. I told her I'd given up on enabling her, that those were different things, even if they didn't feel that way from where she was sitting. She nodded slowly. She said she understood the difference. She said she was trying to learn how to stand without something to lean on. I told her that was the only useful thing she could do. She went back inside. I returned to the cabinet. The wood smelled good in the afternoon air, clean and purposeful. I worked until the light went. On the 28th day, my wife came downstairs with a box in her hands. She set it on the kitchen table. It was full of files, papers, printouts. She said she had put together a complete accounting of where the money had gone. Every transaction she could trace. She said my stepdaughter had helped her reconstruct what she could. I sat down and went through it. It took about an hour. It was not a complete accounting. There were still gaps, but it was genuine effort in a direction I hadn't expected. When I finished, I looked at her across the table. I asked why now. She said because she was leaving. She had found a small house to rent about 12 minutes away. Her daughter had agreed to take over half the rent. They were moving at the end of the week. I sat with that for a moment. She said she was not doing it to punish me or to make a statement. She said she was doing it because she had realized, over the past 4 weeks, that she had never learned how to be in a relationship without managing it. That managing me had been easier than facing what she was doing. That watching me refuse to be managed had taught her something uncomfortable about herself. I told her I appreciated her saying that. She asked if there was any version of things in which we might find our way back to each other. I told her I didn't know. I told her that was honest. She looked at me for a long time. Then she said, "You're the stillest person I've ever known. I used to think it was strength. Then I thought it was stubbornness. Now I think it might just be who you are." I told her it was. She nodded once. She picked up the box and carried it toward the hallway. On the last morning, my stepdaughter brought the baby downstairs before the van arrived. The little girl walked over to me with her particular determined toddle and leaned her head against my knee. I put my hand on her hair. My stepdaughter watched and didn't say anything. When the van honked from the driveway, she picked up the baby, looked at me once, and walked out the door. I stood in the kitchen for a while after the sound of the engine faded. The house settled back into itself over the following weeks, the way old houses do when the people in them stop carrying something heavy. I fixed the bathroom faucet that had been slow for 8 months. I repainted the mudroom. I drove up to see my son in Portland for a long weekend and had the kind of conversation with him that I hadn't been able to have for years, unhurried, with nothing unresolved beneath the surface of it. I began working with the bank on the HELOC repayment. The terms were manageable, not easy, but manageable. I had lived through tighter years. 7 months after they left, my wife called on a Sunday afternoon. She sounded different, quieter in the way that means something has actually settled, not suppressed. She said she had started seeing a therapist. She said she had spent 40 years putting herself between her daughter and difficulty, without ever asking whether the difficulty might be necessary. She said the therapist had helped her see that clearly. I listened. She said my stepdaughter was working now. A real position, benefits, the full thing. The baby's father had begun paying support. They were managing the rent. Not comfortably, but genuinely. I said that sounded like progress. She said, I keep thinking about something you told me. About consent. About how you were never asked. I've been thinking about how many people in my life I never asked. I just assumed I knew what was good for everyone. I said that was a difficult thing to see about yourself. She agreed. We talked for 40 minutes. Not about money, not about the past 2 years, just about life. What she was reading, what I was building, the azaleas she'd asked me to send a photo of when they bloomed. I took the picture the following Saturday and sent it without a message attached. She replied with one word, beautiful. I am not a man who reaches conclusions quickly. I live inside questions longer than most people are comfortable with. The contractor's instinct, probably never commit the final nail until you're certain about the structure beneath it. What I have concluded, 7 months into this new version of my life, is this. I do not regret the marriage. I learned things inside it that I could not have learned any other way, about the ease with which a reasonable person can be gradually relieved of their own life by people who love them imperfectly, about the courage it takes to be still when everything around you is demanding reaction. I do not hate my wife. I do not hate my stepdaughter. I am not a man built for hatred, and at 63, I have less interest in caring things that serve no purpose. What I learned is simpler and harder than any of that. I learned that the most important account I keep is not at any bank. It is the private ledger of what I will and will not accept, of what I have earned and what belongs to me. Not the money, but the hours of my life that created it. When someone begins to spend from that ledger without asking, the answer to it is not anger. Anger is what they expect, and they have prepared for it. The answer is stillness, a clear and settled accounting, a line drawn without apology. My father worked for 35 years in conditions that would be unacceptable today, in the summer heat and the winter cold, because he believed in a simple equation. Honest work, honestly kept. He never had much, but he was never robbed of what was his. I carry that forward. If you've listened to this and recognized something in it, the slow accumulation, the explanations that almost add up, the feeling of being in your own life as a guest, I want you to know that the recognition itself is the beginning of something. You don't have to decide everything today. You just have to stop pretending you don't see what you see. The accounts are yours. The house is yours. The hours that built both of them are yours. I'm not telling you what to do with that. I'm just telling you it's true. Leave a comment below and tell me where you're watching from. Tell me what you've held on to and what you finally had to let go. We tell stories like this one because the quiet ones are the truest. And sometimes the only way to know you're not alone is to say it out loud. Subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. I'll be right here.